So I'm going to go very, very quickly through a couple of PPT slides and just give you a sense of what Michelle and I are talking about. Then I want to turn a little bit to a study that I did, and then the wonderful Michelle Fine is going to talk about her work in the courts, and she's also going to wrap up, and hopefully we'll be able to have a good question and answer session. Sorry, it's hard for me with these ropes. So we call this critical bifocality, the dynamics of privilege and marginalization, and this is designed for the qualitative methods group. Let me just give you a couple of definitions here, and then I'm going to move to what we're doing. Critical bifocality is a way to think about epistemology, design, and the politics of education research, a theory of method in which researchers try to make visible the linkages or circuits through which structural conditions are enacted in policy and reform institutions, as well as the ways in which such conditions come to be woven into community relationships and metabolized by individuals. We are interested in structures and lives. Lots of people study lives, lots of people study structures. We're really interested in the interplay between those two levels. While critical bifocality is today a lens on neoliberal policies and practices in the United States, this commitment to bifocals, dedicated theoretical and empirical attention to structures and lives can be adjusted to varying contexts, historic moments, and accompanying institutional arrangements. This is not just about the US. I've had a student recently do some work in China, and this is applicable to a wide range of nations, a wide range of differentially situated groups in these nations, and these are the kinds of things we're encouraging. Critical bifocality works to encourage design that traces how widening inequality gaps penetrate lives and communities across and within nations, how the neoliberal realignment of opportunities and resources, which is going on globally, as you all know, exacerbate race and class stratification, how the accumulation of privilege is implicated in the deepening of poverty, and how those who benefit and those who lose make sense of our contemporary economic and political circumstances. So Michelle and I are ethnographers. I mean, that's what we do. And we're deep in communities. We take ethnography very, very seriously, but we also put that ethnography in conversation with these kinds of frameworks and ask that we look at two levels at the same time. I'm not going to do the specifics of the method. We just don't have that much time. But let me just make one introductory comment to the college admissions process, which is the work that I did and I'm going to talk about today. The college admissions process in the United States is a business. It's a huge business. I mean, billions of dollars are spent every year with people trying to position their kids for college. And in the United States, I've given talks like this in lots of different countries. And in the United States, we differ very much from any other country in the world because we actually do dossier, depending on how you want to pronounce it, dossier presentations. In other words, every applicant at a four-year institution is putting together a full dossier. And that has implications for a lot of things. So that's unlike the system in the UK, where people take certain tests at the end of secondary school and then take certain examinations. It's unlike the case of China. It's unlike the case of Korea and virtually every other country. We do not have a single test in the United States. It's very different. The Brits actually are appalled when they hear about my data on this. And I'm sorry to say it, but I really think part of that is because there's a streak that believes that class is born, not made. Okay, unlike Americans, we think that it's made. Secondly, when I was in the Nordic countries are appalled by this as well because they don't want their nations to go the way of the United States. And one very smart graduate student stood up and said, this is the closest thing to insanity that he has ever heard. I also have given a number of talks in China. That's a very different kind of response. They agree that the same thing is going on in China, and many people sitting in the audience are very anxious to find out how to do it. So it's a very different kind of context. Okay, let me quickly talk about contextual factors. Piketty's voluminous corpus of research underscores intensifying inequalities in capital and wealth in the late 20th and early 21st century, most notably in the United States. And I'm not going to go through all these, you can read this, but the United States has become much more unequal than it's ever been before, and it is also the case that educational inequalities are massively expanding. One only has to read the recent work of Sean Reardon to find out what's been happening just with achievement test score data. We are becoming far more unequal if you look at the top 10% and the bottom 10% than we've ever been before. So that's one sort of contextual factor. The second, as a consequence, the vast majority of highly educated professionals, as well as those who inherited modest wealth from their parents, find their relative position substantially eroding in relation to a class of the super rich. The realignment and increased consolidation of capital and wealth has deep implications for the ways in which relatively privileged parents, in other words, not the top 1%, largely talking about the top 20% in the United States, strive to position themselves and their children for the future. In addition to altered economic context, the struggle over entrance to a particular strata of post-secondary destinations, particularly in this case, those deemed most competitive, highly competitive, and highly competitive plus by Barron's, takes place on massively altered admissions terrain. The entire situation with the American universities has changed. We're far more stratified. We've always had the 2 versus 4 year distinction. We now have many more distinctions. By the way, this was the end of the ethnographic work that we did, these conclusions. We did not start there. Massively altered admissions terrain has also been accompanied by new forms of stratification within the higher education sector in the US, a form of stratification that layers on top of and extends well beyond entrenched forms of stratification within higher education, such as the 2 versus 4 year sector. I'm going to go quickly through this. Recent studies suggest that where you go to college makes a tremendous amount of difference and an increasing amount of difference in terms of what happens to you after you leave college. So this is, especially the big privates are amassing unbelievable amounts of resources, challenging the big research publics in very key ways. And underneath those institutions, the rest of the institutions have lost more. There's very, very good work by Sheila Slaughter and Larry Leslie and Barrett Taylor on this kind of work. They just came out with a new book on stratification in higher education. That's it. I'm not talking about all these things. I'm not talking about the outcomes, but we have all these data. So let me just tell you a little bit about the study that we did. We were in 3 secondary schools, and one of these secondary schools was, 2 of the secondary schools were NAIS schools, National Association of Independent Schools, which are private schools in the United States, and the 3rd school was an affluent suburban secondary school. Okay, so we were in these 3 schools. We kept 2 of the people working with me were at the time graduate students. One was Kristen Cipollone, the other was Heather Jenkins. Kristen was in the affluent suburban school with the top 10% of kids because it's a lot larger than the private schools. I was in one NAIS school with the top 20% of kids, as noted by the counselor, and Heather was in 2 private schools, one of which overlapped with the one that I was in, and she was with the low-income, self-identified Black students who entered these schools on special intake programs. Our methodology was constant throughout. We actually worked with these kids and their parents and their counselors and their teachers for a year and a half in all 3 sites. So we were in there constantly as participant observers. We interviewed people, we interviewed the parents, we interviewed counselors, teachers, administrators, and so forth. So the design of the study kept all these things relatively constant. And people always ask us, actually, did we intend to write a book? Okay, the answer is no. We had absolutely no idea. I had no idea this was going to be a book. I had no idea we would be writing together. But what we ended up doing is when I was supervising their chapters, I realized that even though all 3 studies started at a different place, I realized that we were all talking about the production of social class, and actually a new social class, which I will argue is now in place for at least 100 years. And it's a very different kind of class structure than has been the case over the past in the United States. So that's where this started. The study was funded by Spencer. We did not go to Spencer and say we're studying the production of class. I didn't know that. What I did go to Spencer with was a question that involved the secondary to post-secondary transition process and the fact that other than Pat McDonough, who did this work in the 1990s, this had not been studied since there was a real clear realignment of universities in the United States. So that's how this project started. A very, very interesting project. I have the book results, Class Warfare is what it's called, Class Race and College Admissions in Top-Tier Secondary Schools. And there's a lot of, it's received a fair amount of attention. People seem to find it very interesting. It's very theoretically deep, but also unbelievably ethnographically thick. So there's lots and lots of data allowing us to tell this story and to draw conclusions about the production of class at this particular moment in the United States. So I am going to, you have the context, okay, that's the critical bifocality, the three things we're talking about in terms of the economy and Americans losing jobs, okay, a lot of jobs are not here any longer. So that's point number one, we knew that. Point number two is the re-stratification of the post-secondary system in the United States. I did not know the extent to which that was happening. And thirdly, the extent to which going to particularly located post-secondary institutions leads to the next level. A lot of those data have come out recently, and they've come out at a time when, after we started collecting our own data. So that's the critical bifocality. We were bouncing our ethnographic data, our really deep sense of what these people were doing, what they were feeling, what was happening in those schools, with and against these huge alterations in structures in massively altered global context. So I'm going to leave that at that, okay? All of those things are going on. That is really, really hard intellectual work, okay? Doing an ethnography is one thing. That's hard enough, like Michelle and I say. Doing a good descriptive ethnography is very difficult. Trying to bounce those data with and against these broader structural factors is something that you really gotta work at. You gotta keep thinking, you gotta keep reading, you gotta keep moving, okay? So I'm gonna turn really quickly and give you some data from the study, and then I'm gonna make a very quick comment about gender. And let me talk about the parents. The parents, we call this section, Parents Engage the Admissions Process, Thinking, Planning, and Plotting. At the most basic level, privileged parents in the US secondary schools pay for and facilitate college visits, and ultimately pay, in most cases, for the costs of attendance. Put your hands up if you've had any recent experience with the unbelievably intensified college admissions process. Your kids, your friends' kids, your nieces, nephews. Okay, not very many. Okay, good. Very interesting. Okay. Remember, dossier preparation. Okay, not a single test. Okay. In most cases, they pay for the cost of attendance, which in the United States is exceptionally steep, even at state institutions. Places like George Washington University in the United States in DC now costs, last I looked, it was $65,000 a year. Okay. And many of those privates, they may not be quite that much, but they're very, very expensive, and state institutions can run $18,000, $20,000 a year, including room and board. With regard to the increasingly complex admissions process, parents prod, strategize, remind their children to meet deadlines. Remember, I worked with all these people. Stay on top of and get feedback on their college admissions essays. Study for the SAT, ACT, SAT subject tests as relevant, and so forth. Keep your eye on this new SAT, everybody, because trust me, as soon as this new SAT, which is supposed to democratize access to institutions, takes place, all of a sudden we're going to see this unbelievable focus and surge on the SAT 2 subject tests. Okay? Something's going to, certain places look at them already, but it is my belief that this will intensify very fast. Perhaps most importantly, they support their children emotionally as they go through the increasingly long and arduous admission process that spans approximately 2 years, culminating in decision letters from the often 15 to 20 institutions to which they apply. Now, remember, most of these kids in the United States are not at boarding schools. This is not the sector I'm talking about. Same thing is going on at the top boarding schools, Andover, Choate, Trinity, okay? The same thing's going on in the United States. The best that those schools can do now, and I'm very familiar with these data, is best 31% Ivy, MIT, and Stanford. Okay? It used to be almost 100% of kids coming out of that sector of schools were able to position at Ivy, MIT, and Stanford, although the focus was mostly Ivy. Now the best they can do is 31%, which means that there's all sorts of other things going on in these other institutions. Matthews, that's the school I was in. It's obviously pseudonym. Everything is de-identified to the hilt. I'm very strict about stuff like that. Do not leave this array of dossier-building decisions to either their children or the college counselor, despite continued counselor admonitions to the contrary. Counselors are like signs all over the school. This is your child's business, not your business. College is a match to be made, not a prize to be won, okay, signs all over the place. But nobody's going to believe that, okay, nobody accepts that. Each Matthews student is expected to meet with the counselors. They have dedicated college counselors in these schools, unlike the publics, even the fancy publics. Their parents at the end of junior year. From that point on, children are expected to meet with the counselor on their own, deemed necessary. However, it was not at all uncommon for the Matthews parents to schedule additional and not infrequent one-on-one meetings with the school and counselors, contact school counselors by phone and email on a routine basis. This must be incredible. Okay, we did this work about 4 years ago, the actual empirical work. It has only intensified in the last 4 years. These people must get hundreds and hundreds of emails every day. And from there, the parents will take over the process. In spite of the fact that students are themselves expected to assess their own strengths and weaknesses with respect to the admissions process, in other words, assess the field of action and figure out where they fit in that field of action, Matthews parents additionally monitor and assess their children's strengths and weaknesses themselves with an eye toward their chances of acceptance at particular institutions based on parental acceptance of grades, difficulty of course load, and the like. Such vigilance extends well beyond those parents in the privileged secondary schools who are themselves highly educated. Ron Tomlinson, for example, a white working class parent who has no connection at all with private schools in the United States, is, according to veteran head of counseling Dave Henderson, hunting big game. In other words, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. After which comment, Dave said to me, he's not going to get it. The struggle between son and parent is palpable because Matt did his own assessment of where he fits in this broad field of action, and he decided, again, de-identified Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. When I de-identify private, public, and by sector according to Barron's. So Harvard becomes Yale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And Ron wants him to apply to the Ivies mentioned previously. Ron had a long conversation with me, and he wanted me to talk to the son and convince him that he had to apply to Harvard. The son had gone to a sports camp at Harvard during the summer, and he didn't like the school. He didn't feel like he belonged there. He didn't want to go there. But the father wanted me to sit down and talk to the son and convince him that he had to do this. I explained to the father that that was not my job and that he should take up the pluses and minuses with the son. Okay, in any event. As argued earlier, for highly ranked student, remember with the top 20%, at these relatively elite schools, these are not the same kinds of schools that Jane Kenway, Fazil Rizvi, Cameron McCarthy, Aaron Coe were in around the world. Okay, those are boarding schools. There's marked pressure to gain admission to the most selective colleges and universities in the US. Students and parents perceive themselves to be the best of the best and strive to gain entree to the most prestigious post-secondary institutions that are going to confirm this status. In response, parents at Matthews, in collaboration with their children, work to intensify their own strategizing, irrespective of counselor disapproval of this process. The counselors are adamant about this. This is not the parents. It's not supposed to be yours. It's supposed to be the children's. The parents will not let go. Now, that's perhaps understandable, but that's part of what's going on in this particular group. The parents of the low-income self-identified black students, on the other hand, did not have parents strategizing in this kind of way because they didn't have that same connection with the college admissions process. We do a lot of writing about that in this particular book. I'm just going to give you one piece of data. I'm going to flip to the conclusion. Susan and Robert Larkin, okay, were born in continental Europe, again de-identified, and sent their first kids, their older kids, in schools in continental Europe, cast their outsider eye on the process. We interviewed many, many people, by the way. Okay, this is a very short little description of what we did. As they experienced their own schooling in Europe and their two older children attended higher education here. I always gave people the option, the parents the option, of who they wanted to sit down with me. And most of the time, two parents wanted to sit down with me. They wanted to talk. If it was a man and a woman, oftentimes the woman said less, the man said more, but in fact, most of this, as I'm going to talk in a minute, most of this strategizing and prodding is women's work, has become women's work. This is a step up from the kind of stuff we know from the UK, where much of that work was done in early childhood education. This is now another thing that is landing on the plate, or however one wants to put it, of many of these women, and these women are often professionals or high-level managers. So this has been added to their own dossier, if you will. So here's Susan. So I would say the last 8 to 10 years, that means children were in early middle school, if not grade 5. I've heard parents talking about it, the college application admissions process. Here I'm not talking about everything that people do to position for entry to high school. Of course they do that. We talk about that some in the book. We're not talking about Cumin classes at age 2 on the Upper East Side in New York City. They may do that too, okay? But that's not this. This linchpin, I will argue, is at the point of college admissions. And we've got anecdotal evidence that people are calling from the Bay Area, parents are calling from the Bay Area to Harvard to find out which preschool they should send their children to in order to enter Harvard. Now, Harvard doesn't answer, okay? Harvard is not responding to that question. But that is exactly what's going on in this particular thing. By the way, media coverage of this is twofold. Media coverage is that these people are crazy, right? I mean, parents are crazy. They're nuts. They sound crazy. They're hyper. They're helicopter parents and so forth. And the other new media thing that's coming out is, oh, you terrible, highly educated women, you're now, with this assortative mating, you're now responsible for the intensification of inequalities in this country because the men who used to marry people who weren't as highly educated are now marrying people or partnering with people who are as educated. So that's the media coverage. Now, critical bifocality leads us another direction. Okay? Critical bifocality is telling us to look elsewhere and not blame these individuals that are inside this particular set of pressures. Parents of older children, I would say maybe even into middle school, parents are conniving and contriving. Robert, from my point of view, in a real sense, the conniving and contriving started in sophomore year, which is second year in the United States, became much more apparent. So we had heard, Susan, probably more than I had, we'd heard the noise, some of the sure things, but it didn't have anything to do with us, things that we had to do as parents. And I think it was at that level we began to realize that it was competitive. And maybe you could have started to send your child to a particular place, a particular institution, to do extracurriculars. And you would tell your colleagues, in other words, other parents of children in the class afterwards, to show how good you were, but you wouldn't actually bring them all together and say, why don't we all send our children to the local cancer research facility to do cancer research? Because everyone, and this is what Robert's saying, everyone wanted to get a step ahead with their children, was my impression. So they began to feel this intensification. This has now become Mitch, sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but I'll think of it in a second. But there has been work done on this, where this is now the model of good parenting in the United States. This is the model of good parenting. And if you don't do this, you are not a good parent. I understand that at the University of Chicago press board meeting, where this was published, that they actually had a big discussion about this, with half the members of the board, and I understand they're all faculty members, saying this is just good parenting. And the other half saying, this is insane. They like the book, okay? But this is now becoming identified as good parenting in the United States. There may be a slight shift. So Susan and Robert, as a result of this, began to encourage Stephanie to maximize her international roots, thereby distinguishing herself. This is all about distinguishing oneself. Distinguishing oneself inside a new field of action, even though they don't use those terms, from others in the college competition, and obviously Bourdieu's work is very helpful in thinking about this. Susan said, I did say to Stephanie, it's all well to say you've traveled, but further down the line this may be mistaken for colleges, because colleges, these kinds of colleges read all the dossiers. They don't only sort by SAT 1 scores and therefore lop off a whole bunch of kids. Thinking, here's a rich kid driving around in expensive cars, you know, staying at a Best Western overseas. I said to her, maybe you have to demonstrate you can do more than that. I knew she could. So I put it to her that she should volunteer at a home in Bogota. And it was started and run by a former colleague of mine. Now, obviously the social capital is coming to play here. From the firm, because otherwise it might have been hard for us to get there because of her age. She was a minor. But there were 170 boys of all ages, just under 20 girls. She spent 2 weeks with them, and was a little tearful when she left. And she did say that she should, if she could take a job there, she might well go back and volunteer. And I thought again that if one wanted to demonstrate her adaptability, that it was the perfect testing ground. Now this has, talk about an architecture of capital accumulation, okay? Because if you look at the language here, her adaptability, she's overseas experience, she has to write, like all people in the United States who are trying to position for a four-year institution, they have to write a personal statement or an admissions essay. Sometimes they have to write 3. Look at all she had to write about, okay? I'm not saying this is not a worthy thing to do, but this group of people is highly conscious, and they have what I call global sensibilities, a sense of global sensibilities being a good thing. What Americans do not understand is that people, by and large, is that people in China, people in Korea now have special schools with special tracks set up to produce dossiers to enter American institutions. This is now a global competition for the same schools that Americans are attempting to position for. Okay? So this language of sort of competence, global competence is one. There's lots of things to keep your eye on, but that's one of them. Okay, okay. I'm going to skip to the end. It's because we don't have that much time, and I'm going to conclude. Let me just, before I do that, let me just give you an idea of what these parents do. Okay, parents don't listen to the counselors, throwing caution to the wind, particularly mothers. They attempt to exert intense control over both the process and admissions outcomes by selectively engaging the following. Everybody's told you cannot control an admissions outcome, okay? Harvard had 28,000 applicants. UCLA had 86,000 applicants a year ago. These are skyrocketing application rates for lots of good reasons, by the way. More people than just the ones that go to these fancy boarding schools think they can position for these schools. Okay? There's a whole range of things that are feeding into this. But at the same time, with those kinds of admissions, with those kinds of admissions numbers, the number of people that these schools are accepting is that much lower. Stanford now takes 5% of its applicants, making it the lowest in the country. And remember, the degree of selectivity, if you will, is an indice in the rankings. So there's all sorts of things that are going on with this stuff where colleges, lots of colleges are hiring big people to make sure that they keep their rankings up. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that do. They're positioning for an international marketplace for admissions, engaging in the continual self-assessment of their children, even though the children are specifically instructed to do it themselves, drawing up lists of calculated criteria for admissions at a wide range of potential colleges. A number of the parents came to me with spreadsheets. They had all the data in front of them. Keeping at times spreadsheets with regard to admitted student tests, class rank data, schools under consideration, informally or formally assessing the probability of admission, drawing up fine-grained plans with regard to family trips to visit post-secondary destinations all over the country prior to final applications. This can mean 5 or 6 road trips or plane trips or all sorts of other things, clearly predicated on a certain amount of financial privilege, okay? Debriefing after all trips, figuring out where they're actually going to apply, and then a second round of trips to admitted students' weekends where they decide where they're finally going to go. Okay. I'm going to wrap up. And this is just a note on gender. I actually altered my presentation because I realized so many people had read so carefully class warfare and critical bifocality in particular. Here I've argued that underneath massive shifts in the global economy, okay, that's number one, as accompanied by market intensification of inequalities of income and wealth and intensified stratification of the U.S. post-secondary sector, privileged families mobilize every single bit of cultural, social, and economic capital to carve out distinction with respect to the college admissions process. This is engaged with an eye toward new and or continued privilege for their children via admission to particularly located post-secondary destinations. Key fact here, okay? This new upper middle class, this is what we call it. This new upper middle class is most definitely not going to be all white. It is going to be very diverse. I am not saying that there's lots and lots of poor people in there and historically located underrepresented minorities. There will be some, but it's also not going to be all white, and that's also very complicated. Although the social and economic terrain has changed for everyone in the States, a particularly located slice of the historically forged, broad-based middle class, which was together in something, is activating any and all intellectual, economic, and personal capitals to lay the groundwork for the construction of what will arguably be a new upper middle class of the 21st century. The particular role that gender plays in such class construction is worthy of comment. I'm going to just make a real quick statement on this. This question of gender should span lots and lots of studies. This is really something. I'm not saying women weren't responsible for schooling, and yes, okay, but this is something new. This is taking a new shape and form. Although largely uninvited and in fact denigrated by the school, I heard lots of things about this, the self-embraced, what we call classwork, chronicled here in relation to the post-secondary admissions process in privileged secondary schools, not all private, is in fact largely mother work, comprised of a set of intellectual and practical actions and activities that often, although not uniformly, sit side by side high-level professional and managerial commitments among women. Although fathers certainly participate in this process and go on virtually all college visits that have been arranged by mothers, they generally script themselves as having to worry about paying for it, which is a big deal, okay? I do not dismiss that. Rather than taking full or even primary responsibility for all aspects of the intricate planning process. As such, the actual parental work involved in class warfare over post-secondary destinations is highly gendered, reminiscent of Ball and Vincent's work on middle-class women's role in child rearing. This particular moment of this deepening and reconfigured mother work, if you will, is highly ironic because women were locked out of these institutions for centuries, frankly, as were people of color, okay? And these people were locked out. These are the very people that are now inside trying to position both their sons and daughters for these top institutions as they're moving forward. And that admission to these schools cannot be assumed by anybody any longer. This is really, Harvard can fill its entrant class with perfect SAT scores. Some kids coming from particular groups have published articles at the end of high school, okay? What I'm arguing here is that the stark insertion of gender and gendered labor into new class processes and productions arguably and fundamentally alters the fulcrum of class struggle and class warfare as it takes shape and form in the current historic moment, where men comprise the center of class analysis historically and class struggle of the not too distant past via industrial workplace struggles and or the accumulation of management of economic capital. It's now women, via the kind of class positioning that we see here, who are now sitting at the dual epicenter of new class productions, formation, and outcomes. And I think this is going to set the stage for lots of important work that we all need to do to see exactly how these are playing out in different kinds of communities. Because what's happening at the top is also reverberating through the system in lots of really important ways. So thank you very much. Michelle's talking about this in conversation.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle Fine. I'm not going to be talking about critical participatory action research today. Tomorrow, I promise I will, okay? So today I'm going to talk about schlepping. Can you say schlepping in medicine? Yeah? And you all know what I mean? If you don't know, schlepping. It's Yiddish for like carrying critical bifocality into courtrooms. Okay, is that, how many of you are ed policy-ish? So I want to talk about what it means to try to take a serious, critical, bifocal perspective into policy. In the half-ish hour that maybe I have, I want to reflect a bit on my role as an expert witness in court cases. I've been involved in almost 24 high-profile class action lawsuits about educational injustice, where I'm given the rare opportunity to gather narrative and quantitative material from a wide range of children, usually children in poverty, who have been miseducated, excluded from opportunity, misrecognized, and betrayed by the public sector, in hopes that I can theorize this material and tell a different story than the one that is being told about these young people. Often when I enter courtrooms, and I'll give you some examples, I feel like I'm in a very delicate traffic jam between terrifying neoliberal reform and radical possibilities, to quote from our friend Jean Anion. Critical bifocality in my backpack. I smuggle in stories of history, structure, so that we're not fetishizing these disparities, like, why are there more discipline problems with black kids than white kids? Why do they have lower test scores, black kids and white kids? Why do they, would finance equity really make a difference given how poor they are? Those are the kinds of cases I'm involved in. And if you just stay on the downstream indicator of disparity, it's over. You need to introduce more about history, more about structure, more about the accumulation of dispossession. And that's partly what I try to do in court. I've testified in the Citadel case, where young women were suing to gain access to a public all-male military academy in South Carolina. Happy to talk about any of this. I maybe shouldn't have done that one. It's actually really interesting when you're fighting for access into institutions that refuse to transform. Let me just put that as a thought bubble for all of you. I have fought for access for kids of color to get into historically white schools, girls to get into boys' schools, and I worry because lawyers aren't actually very interested in making an argument about transformation. They want to argue a kind of neoliberal access, assimilation, just let them in, nothing has to change except for maybe you'll buy a Tampax machine at the Citadel, right? And if you have to kind of contain the more radical imagination for transformation, you might be inviting young people into institutions where they're going to be surrounded by what some would call structural violence in the name of civil rights. So let me start with my concluding dystopic idea. I was involved in the case in Wedowee, Alabama, where the principal canceled the prom because of biracial dating. I don't know if you remember that. You probably mostly weren't born, but a young woman, white woman, was dating a black kid. Her mother called the principal, Hewland Humphreys, and said, "Can you talk to Sherry because she's dating a black kid, and we're really worried." And Hewland Humphreys was thrilled to talk to Sherry. He called her into the office, and he said, "Sherry, you shouldn't date him because your children won't be very smart. You won't be invited to family reunions, and no white boy's ever going to want you." And she said, "I don't ever want a white boy." She walked out. He then invited all of the kids into the auditorium, where he said, "I won't tolerate mixed race dating." And then he called on Shawanda, a biracial young woman, and said, "Who are you taking to the prom?" And she said, "Chris, white boyfriend." And he said, "I won't tolerate mixed race dating. You were a problem, and you were a mistake, and we won't have any more mistakes." Shawanda, no fool, found her way to the Southern Poverty Law Center, got her college tuition paid for, and the black families and mixed race families in the community set up freedom schools. So I rode down on a horse with the Justice Department, and it's actually an amazing story. I'm happy to give you more details. I was also an expert witness in Williams v. California. I got to work with Jeannie Oakes and Linda Darling Hammond, and it's a case that basically boils down to low-income kids get to go to highly under-resourced schools. Jeannie looked at, I think, Linda looked at teacher qualifications, and Jeannie looked at facilities, and somebody else looked at finance, and I was the social psychologist asked to document how all of these conditions produce educational inequity, kind of connecting the dots between dead rats in the swimming pool and school dropout, which is kind of social psychological magic. And I was most recently involved in a case called Reed v. California, documenting the impact of what it means to attend schools with 40 to 60% long-term subs. Anybody from California? Know the California schools well? Schools have 40 to 60% long-term. Some of my best friends are long-term subs, but it doesn't mean that they're preparing young people. And of course, we would never do this in the schools that Lois was just talking about. And I've been involved in 2 new cases, one of which I will go into, in which civil rights lawyers are convinced that poor children are being denied instructional time, inadequate amounts of extra learning time. I'm sure you dealt with this at Spencer. We've all heard about grants for extra learning time because of lockdown, school violence, immigration raids, high teacher turnovers, illness, lice, buildings falling apart in low-income schools. I've testified about the academic and racial consequences of high-stakes testing and why excluding girls from the Citadel is not only bad for the girls, but really bad for the boys. And if I get a chance, I've gotten tripped up in some cases where I didn't realize the case was nested in a larger neoliberal commitment to privatize public education. It's one of the risks one runs by joining these lawsuits, that any critique of public education runs the risk of being appropriated by privatizers. I don't need to tell you this in Wisconsin, but it keeps us in a very funny bind, that if you critique, you run the risk of being appropriated. So these long-term sub-cases, the day after I testified, we won. I can't explain the details, take too long, but the headline was Villa Rosa saying first nail in the coffin of tenure cases. And I'd spent a lot of time with lawyers and journalists saying, no, this was a case about equity and tenure being highly compatible, sacred commitments, not one against the other. But you never know whose theater you're dancing in. And I don't need to tell Wisconsin, and I live in Jersey. But any public critique will be metastasized into a reason to privatize. And so it keeps those of us who are researchers in an odd place. In these cases, we bring together existing empirical literature. We gather original data. I'm not an expert witness who just goes in and just talks about the existing work. I always go in with graduate students and we collect data. Ethnography interviews, statistical information surveys, archival analyses, and then we theorize stories for court, curate the stories on a landscape of research, my own experience, and I try to squeeze in what might be thought of as excessive stories, that is, stories about history and structure and not just the present conditions. And we discuss what Jessica Ruggles and I call circuits of dispossession and privilege, demonstrating that one community's marginalization and oppression is deeply connected to another community's accumulation of privilege, which is how Lois and I continue to live together and work together, understanding that the privilege that those kids are amassing is at the price of the young people where I'm hanging out in these cases. So it's fascinating to do this work. It's usually undertaken with graduate students. It's filled with fantasies of impact. You go to court, you get to win, and the profound disappointment the morning after the decision. Kind of like, think Brown versus Board of Education. I carried the whispers of Emily Dickinson in my belly when she wrote, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." So I try to tell the truth at a racial justice slant. It's a geometric question: whose slant, at which angle? Can I tell a story that's good enough not to alienate the judge, deep enough to be accountable to the community that I've worked with? And also, when you enter court, remember again, Brown versus Board of Ed, most injustice stories have to be layered on damaged narratives. It's an unfortunate consequence of the relationship between Thurgood Marshall and Kenneth Clark, that one had to demonstrate that black kids were so broken by segregation, that they deserve integration. And we have seen that narrative rehearsed over and over again in courts, that you have to demonstrate broken bodies for justice. And as a social psychologist who happens to have been lucky enough to spend 30 years in education, I spent a lot of time refusing the equivalence of injustice and damage. But in our research and in our political work, I fear that those two things have been conflated. Do you get what I mean? So Kenneth Clark did all this work demonstrating terrible, terrible self-esteem of black kids, and that's the way we move toward integration. And I think that's a real problem in both education and psych, that the only way we can say something has been unfair is to say the people are broken. It's a losing argument, but it's very much the way the courts work. Let's see. Oh, well, that's a terrible idea. All right. You might say that I curate stories. It's funny, I was telling Lois, I walked past an art store the other day, a framing store, and they had a book in there called The Secret Life of Frames. And I think that's actually what I do. I think about how to frame a story, to tell a story, to quote from Arundhati Roy, a story different one than we're being brainwashed to believe, right? When I am in court, I have to undo the dominant stories that are already floating in the courtroom. So one is that money doesn't matter. When I was involved in the Williams case, anybody ever get involved in, like lawyers are they're very mean to you, and then they're very nice to you over lunch. It's absurd. And like they ask you if you want their food, and I'm like, you were just like really nasty. No, anyway. And a lawyer from LA, over lunch, I was saying, where do your kids go to school? Private schools, of course. And I said, how could you look in the mirror and argue that poor kids don't deserve more resources for their schools? And he said, we all know that money doesn't matter. Their lives, and I said, if money doesn't matter, why don't you put your kid in a school that gets $4,000 a year or $5,000, right? But that's a dominant story. Another dominant story is blacks just do better in all black schools, right? And there's some evidence, but that's used to keep blacks out of more elite, whiter schools. Or that unions undermine student achievement. Or that these students are so damaged it's not worth the investment. And unfortunately, lawyers say things like this. And we know those are popular beliefs. So I have to kind of undo those, and then I worry about reproducing essentialist arguments about access, like you can allow girls into all boys institutions and not have to deal with the sexism and the homophobia. You can get black kids into predominantly white schools and not deal with the curriculum. I will never say that, and so lawyers find me a little tricky because I'm trying to put a little more inside this little hole that's about access. Do you get what I mean? Jody Mellema talks about multicultural neoliberalism, the kind of desire to get diverse bodies up to the top of institutions so we can freeze out everybody else. And that's what some of these court cases sometimes feel like. All right, so I'm gonna enter a case because time goes more quickly up here than it does when you sit there. In the Williams case, one of the great things about these cases is discovery is a process where the other side has to give you all this information. So you get declarations and depositions and data, and 40 to 60% of the teachers, and they're getting pink slips, et cetera. In the Williams case, which was simply about immigrant, poor, and black and brown children going to under-resourced schools, we had focus groups of young people who were randomly called on the phone, and we ran 20 of these focus groups of 10 each. First, I give them a survey, so we get individual level data, for those of you who want to know about the methods. And then I have them go around, and I had them all say one good thing about their school and one more troubling thing about their school. These were all kids going to disinvested schools. The reason I do that, this is a qualitative nightmare. This is alive, frightening. That's even worse. Should I do something with this, like turn it off? Can't figure it out. Here, yours. It's a qualitative researcher's nightmare. The other side has access to all the tapes. So like when you analyze data and some things you leave out, well, you can't do that. So I do this thing of looking particularly non-leading, like tell me something you love about your school, and they all do that, and then tell us something it's a little worrisome about your school, and then I handed out pictures of highly resourced schools and poorly resourced schools, and what do you think about these schools? And kids will right away say, white kids must go to that school, right? So, and then we talk about what is great. Tell me about a time where you really learned something, right? And one of the things that's really gorgeous, and I've now done this with hundreds of kids, totally betrayed by our public institutions, and you say, tell me about, there's always some teacher who marked my paper up with red comments and said, you're not a good writer yet, but I'm going to show you how to be a good writer. Or gave me a book that I didn't know how to read and said, I'm going to help you figure out how to read this. Have you had a lot of those teachers? No, not really. And then at the very end, I would say, in the Williams case, I'm about to go to talk to a judge about the schools that you go to. Tell me one thing that you wish for your favorite school. And one little girl said, Elena, the daughter of migrant workers, an 8th grader, said, I would just like a school with a seat on every toilet and enough paper to clean yourself. And that was the opening of my expert report. And on the basis of that, the lawyers to the other side wanted me removed as an expert, right? Because the qualitative material just gets to them. A 4 on a 10-point scale doesn't break your heart, right? So that for those of you doing qualitative work, they tell a story. That one line tells a story that's so deep about what is and what isn't, what's expected, what's desired, what's yearned for. I want to take you into a case that's a more recent case. The courtroom is a wrestling match for dueling research narratives on a floor that is profoundly uneven. The dominant story enjoys well-funded lawyers, can mobilize lots of evidence, and can relax on a bed of common sense shared by the judge and if there's a jury. The counter-narrative has to chip away gently at the dominant story, like these kids' lives are so miserable anyway, why would a good school matter? You have to chip away at it with legal logic, empirically demonstrated harm, need and capacity, and you have to promise that the prescribed remedy will miraculously resolve the scalding, historic, and deep scars of injustice. Therein lies the fantasy of this work. Educational equities constitute what planning designers Horst Riddell and Melvin Weber call wicked problems. Entangled, crusty, reproductive, with many origins and mutations. But the courts want what these same authors call soluble problems. Those of you in education policy know the headache I'm talking about, I hope. Critical bifocality seeks to reveal the wickedness, but also shed light on the assemblage, that is, the fracture lines where possibility might breathe. So in 2016, I was asked to get involved in a class action lawsuit contending that poor children deserve more and enjoy less instructional time in school because of violence, lockdowns, interruptions, long-term subs, immigration raids, over-reliance on testing, illness. I was working with John Rogers and Nicole Mira at UCLA, and they were doing a statewide statistical analysis of the extent to which kids attending poor schools, in fact, had more disruptions on instructional time than kids attending wealthy school. And of course, they were able to demonstrate that students who attend extremely poor high schools lose on average 25 days a year, almost 14%, to in-school disruptions. Out of school, if there's violence in the community, they lock down the school, then their wealthier peers. So we were hired to conduct a qualitative assessment of the systematic disruptions of instructional time as experienced by students and teachers in low-income schools. We, Corey Green, Sonia Sanchez, and myself, we facilitated a set of focus groups with teachers and students from low-income schools in Oakland, LA, and San Francisco. And what we would do, and our focus was on instructional time. Here's my hope of what you're understanding. You can enter with a simple variable like instructional time, or student achievement data, or disciplinary data. And then it is our obligation to demonstrate the structures, the policies, and the histories that have produced these disparities. Does that make sense? Rather than accepting these disparities as in and of themselves, it's refusing the downstream analysis of just looking at the simple outcomes. So we set up these focus groups with teens and teachers. I'm mostly just going to talk about the teens. And we had a 4-part method. First, we did a survey. We always do that because I like having a kind of quantitative skeleton against which to kind of hang the stories that we gather. Then we had young people draw maps. This is a method that Stanley Milgram and Jodelet developed in Paris, where they had people drawing where are the safe spaces in Paris in the 60s. We've been doing maps a lot, particularly in conditions of injustice where people have very different access to literacy or comfort. Talking about painful experiences, actually drawing creates a whole other setting. We've done it at Columbia University with law students. We've done it with these young people. I'm happy to send you, there's an article on the history of these identity maps. They're theoretically actually very, very rich. So we had young people develop maps, and the simple prompt was, draw what time feels like in your body in school. I know it sounds like a question you couldn't answer, but they did. And we got maps of a snail. We got pictures of a clock whose hands wouldn't turn. We got one kid who drew a line down the middle and he wrote AP classes, and all the kids' hands were like this, and low track classes, and there were prison bars in front. And one young man, Carlos, he was Latino, gay president of his school. He drew a picture, and he said, so this is the yellow brick road. Me and my friends are walking down the yellow brick road, and you could see we're like walking, and some of our friends fall off, and some of our teachers fall off because of high-stakes testing. And he said, I don't even know if anybody is behind the green curtain. You know who's behind the green curtain, but they don't. But he's still walking. And he said, so I don't even mind the walking. I don't really mind the tests, although I know it's making a lot of my friends and teachers upset. He said, but the thing you have to watch out for are the flying monkeys. You know when you're doing ethnography and you wait for the metaphor to land in your lap? And so flying monkeys became a metaphor for the precarity that young people are living in. And once he said that, another young woman said, I'm actually supposed to go to Princeton this summer to some summer program. My brother got shot. I don't know if I should go. Another little girl says, 2 of my brothers are in jail. And they call me every morning and they say, do you have enough money? And they were so worried about me making it to this interview today. But it was told like a story of love, not a story of shame. And another young man said, my dad was deported last month. And so this notion of precarity became a pretty dominant theme for us. And then when we interviewed the teachers, they talked about the incredible precarity of teaching in these schools, of mandates that were making them crazy, of expectations that were unrealistic. Economic, familial, political, and embodied and academic precarity saturated these young lives. Young people who were most vulnerable to material dislocations of family, home, school, nation, and relationships were also hyper vulnerable to education reform that was highly disruptive, that was removing their teachers, closing their schools, making them go through multiple examinations and tests and failures. And it was an astonishing recognition that the young people who lead the most precarious lives are exposed to the most, what is proudly called at Harvard Business School, disruptive innovations, which I don't have time to go through, but I'm happy to chat with you in 5 minutes for conversation. I gave a TED Talk at MIT with a bunch of innovators. These were Black innovators who were part of the computer technology world. And I was invited, I was the white woman, because a friend of mine ran it. And I was with all of these young, beautiful innovators who were quoting Mark Zuckerberg and Eli Broad, names you must know, who seemed to say, who have as their mantra, move fast and break things, right? And I got up the second day and I said, I know you think my whiteness is what's distinct about my presentation, but actually I hang out in communities where you moved fast, you broke things, and I hang out with the kids who are still left behind. There's no accountability in the disruptive innovation world. That school, and so to realize that what is now seen as kind of cutting edge ed reform, whether it's in Milwaukee or in Newark or in California, that closes schools, move teachers, the language is churning teachers. It's not bad if you churn them every few years, right? When in fact these young people's lives are so fundamentally precarious. At the end of our focus groups, we asked, tell us about a time when time flies in school, when you just lost track of time, when you were learning so much you forgot about everything. And they broke into small groups, and it was just gorgeous. You could imagine they created inquiry-based projects. They created participatory work. They created projects that took time, that took place over time, that connected to community. It wasn't hard for them to imagine that. In Oakland, California, I facilitated a group, and usually I'm pretty good with kids. I can get them to talk. They were just so depressed talking about school and time, and at the very end I said, so there's this lawsuit, and you know the civil rights struggle is to get more time for all of you, and this one young man looked me in the eye and he said, lady, you seem really nice. Please don't make us go to school for longer days. It already feels like jail. The young people successfully flipped the script from a narrow question of disparities to the larger wicked problem of precarity and miseducation within their schools and cross-sector structural betrayal. Listening closely, we learned 3 things. And again, I credit this to the work that Lois and I have done in thinking through how do you get behind the story? How do you tell a different story? Listening closely, we learned 1, beware the seductive appeal of technical solutions to wicked problems. They are all around us, and they are in drag as a civil rights agenda these days. 2, it's a cruel policy irony that the young people with the most personally, materially, and existentially precarious lives attend the schools that are most structurally unstable. A colleague I met in South Africa this summer, Achille Mbembe, calls that necropolitics. That is politics that determines who lives and who dies. And 3rd is even in circumstances of massive disinvestment and civic betrayal, young people in highly precarious circumstances nevertheless yearn for opportunities to be respected, recognized, and educated, to dive into critical histories, create opportunities for and with their communities, particularly younger children, and to mobilize for educational justice. We interviewed the same kids who went to these schools at a summer program, one at Berkeley and one at UCLA, where they are engaged in very critical education, and they were so engaged. When I asked them about time, the pictures were so different. They were like, not the banking model, quotes by Che, you know, give us our ethnic histories, give us our civic histories. I want to work hard. I want to learn things I don't know. I don't want to be disrespected and disparaged within the place called schooling. Despairing about their schools, these young people nevertheless have a thirst to be educated. By listening to the voices of young people speaking across very different educational settings, we learn just how much context matters when it looks like it's about the kid, when it's really about context. Demographically identical youth were so passionately engaged in settings that invited inquiry, critical history, creativity, and deep participation, and so fundamentally alienated in settings corroded by neoliberal reforms. More instructional time is, of course, a human right, particularly for young people routinely denied equal time in school, and yet more time and systematically disinvested in dehumanizing buildings is no one's idea of justice. Ultimately, we chose not to testify. We met with the lawyers and explained that we couldn't testify for the civil right to more instructional time in schools that violate the dignity of the young. We continue to work with lawyers, youth, community activists advocating for more time in worthy educational settings, and we continue to write on precarity, not only as the rallying cry of Occupy and activist movements in Europe, but as a material condition, a struggle, and also a source of wisdom in young people who are struggling to find education in incredibly unequal times. Thank you. Is this your phone?
No, it's a black one underneath the...
Yep. So should we take questions, thoughts? Should I sell phones? Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a question about time. So you were asking, so I do visual methods in my study as well, and I used time. But I was looking at it as a priority, like to look at priorities at student athletes, like where they were spending their time. So how did you come up with your method for time, and how did you analyze, I don't know if this is too detailed, but how did you analyze the visual data to make, to have an argument about how they thought about time?
Cool. Why don't we popcorn up a bunch of questions and then we can, is that okay? So popcorn, go.
Hi, I'm a doctoral student in educational policy studies. I have two questions. The first is for Professor Weiss. We read your book in Professor Lee's class recently, and I just had a question. Is it easy, not easy, is it possible to do multi-sided ethnography by yourself? Because I know you had your grad students. Is it, I'm just thinking of my own work, and is it even a reality for me to do multi-sided work? And then my second question for both of you, you both seem to do qualitative and quantitative work, and it seems like you both do them both really well. And is it possible to be both a good ethnographer and to also understand quant stuff? Or are you really good in one and sort of good enough?
Faking it in the other. We'll talk later. Let's get up a few more and... Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. I'm wondering, Lois, if you saw themes of precarity in the people. Precarity seems like such a linchpin in your study, Michelle. And Lois, I'm curious if that was part of how you understood the experiences of those students and things that you were with, although in a very, very different sort of story.
Yeah. Cool.
That's a really good question, too.
Maybe we should try to answer. Go ahead. Oh, okay.
And that may gin up some other questions, right, when we start this discussion.
Let me say that I've been writing a lot now about, on the precarity piece, two versions of this. One is we're writing about what we call an epistemology of precarity, what young people who live in precarious circumstances know about the unpredictability of the world that those of us who have been privileged don't actually know. They know how to smell out adults you can trust. They know how to read situations where the rest of us are, I don't mean to privilege this at all, but I do mean to honor the wisdom that is born in precarity rather than it being seen as paranoia or oversensitivity or how come they don't trust people? I have a foster son. I know why kids might not trust people after they've been betrayed. So we distinguish now epistemology of precarity, which is the wisdom, existential precarity, which we're all like we all got that one, right? Like we all don't know what tomorrow is. And then material and then policy-induced precarity. Qual and quant, you know, I am actually trained, don't tell anybody, as a lab-based social psychologists who lied to people and, put them in situations and to understand how they thought about injustice. I am trained in qualitative and quantitative methods. I was lucky enough to get my first job at Penn. Del Himes was the dean. It was a beautiful, Stacy was, there was a beautiful multi-method building where we could swim in multiple methodologies, understand where they fight with each other and where you can create conversations, not yet. A what place in Spider-Man? It was a crazy place, if that footnote, a little nutty. I on all our when we worked in the prison, we'd like to get lives, but also know that how college reduces recidivism. I like having the quantitative skeleton. It's just, I don't know, it's like my thing to like hang lives on. Visual methods. So I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you about this. In our book, Muslim American Youth, which we did right after 9/11, where a good friend of mine who was Muslim asked me to help him do focus groups with Muslim Americans, and I'm like, I am just really the wrong one. I'm a Jew, So I just like apologized for the first half hour about Israel, about here, and then the best way to do it for me was draw your many selves. Your Muslim self, your athlete self, your daughter self, your sexy self, draw your many selves. And they were remarkably revealing. Boys often draw faces with lines down the middle, American Muslim with a tear, or I want to go back to, these were rich kids in New Jersey until 9/11, right? Who just thought of themselves as Americans, much more like the Japanese kids who were interned than African American or Latinos here, right? And then suddenly they became the other. So those end here. We would code kind of grossly, like time that was degraded, time that was conflicted, and time that was more like Csikszentmihalyi's notion of flow. Where time just keeps moving and is energized. And then we would look at the relationship between those three kind of gross categories and some of the quantitative and narrative stuff. Happy to chat more with that. Go.
Okay, first to the question of multi-sided. Who asked that? Okay, the multi-sided, I think it's really, you lose some, you don't lose some, right? Like we have projects now, I have a project with Barbara Eisenhower, we're in 8 schools. We have 4 schools in Buffalo and 4 schools in Denver. And these are with low-income kids, and we followed these kids for 3 years, and we followed them to college at all, quote, STEM schools and comprehensive schools. And if we didn't have a team, we wouldn't be able to do it. Now, what you can do, I think, is you can be in 2 sites, but you're still compromising some degree of depth. And it's really, I've done some things where I intended to be in 2 sites, and I actually had to back off when it was just me. But it doesn't mean you can't do it, it just means that there's some trade-off, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I'm happy to talk more. Particularly since you have a Wisconsin t-shirt on and I want some of those. Sweatshirt. Anyway, but then to the question of precarity, I don't use the term precarity, I use the term anxiety, but it's actually, these kids, I mean, look, it's not difficult. It's not difficult to look at kids with privilege and say, "Oh, they have it all." But actually, these kids live under enormous pressure now. And in a country where we don't have it's not making excuses for anybody, but in a country where we don't have that kind of history. And this is new. Okay, this is really. I market it 12 years now, where there's been this kind of pressure on kids to perform at certain levels and do certain kinds of things. And I'm not talking about rich kids, okay? I'm talking about people who have highly educated parents, and not always highly educated, and are thinking about the next generation. So I would maybe not use the term precarity, but there's an extraordinarily high degree of anxiety. And I really want the mental health people on my team to find out from another angle what is going on here. And one of the things that's going on in America is there's like nobody's in good shape. Okay, maybe the top 1%. I don't know those people. But nobody's in good shape. Like there are struggles. They're different. Of course, they're different. And some are more obviously much more stressful, much more trying, and have greater confidence, grave confidences, great consequences. But you know, you work with anybody, and they're either worried they're going to be working 90 hours, or they're worried they're not going to have a job, or they're worried they're going to be in jail, or I think.
Yeah. Can I just say something about that? One of the things that's happening in low-income communities is a move toward trauma-sensitive schools. I don't know if that, and I have to say that I'm highly ambivalent. Like, I get it. These young people are contending with much more than I can imagine. But I also worry about a kind of neoliberal strategy that puts it on individual models of dis-ease, rather than, again, it's structural, and yet I know people really need help, right? And but even the gun debates move toward so mental health is becoming a kind of neoliberal basket where a lot of things fall. And it's not that I disagree, but I've been asked to be an expert in a bunch of those cases. It also feels like I would have to make the argument that these kids are so traumatized that, you know, and yet talking friends who are educators, those of you who are working, you know, kids are really traumatized, right? And so how do we acknowledge that as structurally induced and individually embodied, but it's not resolved only through, does that make sense? It's like watching somebody throw bodies off and handing out water wings.
Can I say one other thing about this mixed methods mantra? We're going to talk more about that tomorrow at the Brown Bag, but mixed methods is a mantra. I mean, it's sort of everybody wants people to do mixed methods. People are supposed to do dissertations and mixed methods, and on and on and on. I don't know about anybody in this group, but it's all over the place. And it really has to be, we have to dig into that much more. You know, what are we talking? I don't mean definitional. That's a whole other thing. But what is it? What are we talking about? How do you do it? And yes, personally, I think I will shrink quantitatively, but personally, I think that you can only do one method really, really, really well, and that you have to be on teams that work across methods. That is what I mean. We're actually coming out with a report that was sponsored by the Spencer Foundation on this. It should be out very, very soon. Exactly this kind of, what does it mean? Everybody's talking about it as if it's some savior, and it's not. You know, I mean, it's teamwork. I think profits best.
Can I just say one more? You're great at provoking me, which is why we have this 30-year friendship. So a lot of our participatory, we do what's called stats in action. We do critical statistics in communities. So we're studying aggressive policing in the Bronx, and we bring the NYPD data to the community. And people who I suspect weren't so great at 8th grade math are really good at crosstabs of race by stop and frisk. And so there's a way in which critical secondary analyses of existing databases is really an important skill, and it's some of the participatory budgeting work is that, and it's kind of stunning to watch people get engaged with critical mathematics when it affects their own lives. And so we've been looking at charter school data, at policing data, and you know, grandmothers like run home and then bring glasses, and we meet in the basement of the Yankee Tavern. Right, and it's just pretty interesting, you know, because I think a lot of research in and with low-income communities tends to be qualitative, but I've also found it's, you know, and when they then analyze those data, they say, wait, they did 4,000 stops last year, they only got 8 guns, and let's look at where those guns are. That was 1 gun and 8 kids, right? So it's actually just really helpful, but we shouldn't assume that the quant stuff is just for one class of people, and, you know. Other questions, thoughts?
I
Yeah.
have a question. So my name is Fahima.
Is what?
Fahima.
Fahima.
And I do a lot of work. Like, I'm interested in the body and biopolitics. So I liked when you talked about the this narrative around broken bodies in court that, you know, kind of emerged from Kenneth Clark in his experiment. And then your question in your study, when you asked students to draw what time feels like in your body, that resonated with me so much, because I was like, what a fascinating question. That's something that I would love to do different things with. But I want to know, when you, like, was your decision to include that question, was it related to wanting to kind of get at that broken body, like, narrative in courts, or like, why did you decide to include that sort of question, or why did you ask students to do that?
That's so great. I do a lot of creative writing, and these maps feel like and so I have to think about prompts a lot. So usually at the beginning of my research methods class, people have to write a letter to someone to whom they feel accountable for their research. And it could be a great-grandparent, or it could be a little boy that you taught in kindergarten and you assume is no longer around, or it could be when working with young people and having to move into stuff quickly, moving into body accelerates that. There's also like many nerd parts of me, and one nerd part is kind of interested in the neuroscience of how oppression moves under the skin.
Right, me too.
And Bruce McEwen and the work on allostatic load. And so that's a kind of in the closet frame that I bring to this. Without it, I don't want to argue that oppression has no consequence. And yet I also don't want to argue that damage needs to be evident in order to make the argument about injustice. And so I do find that asking people about where in your, and having been in therapy, when someone says, where do you feel that in your body? I know where I feel, and so then one of the things I say in research methods is like, the unit of analysis and the unit of data collection do not have to be the same thing. You can study a person and analyze American history from that life. And in the same way that asking about bodies, it seems like the most visceral, and I know that precarity is living in bodies, although we didn't start out thinking about precarity, we started out thinking about time. But I heard enough from the kids about how a day of surveillance erodes one's subjective sense of self.
So we're actually at time. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It was fun.